This is a map of every major city in the continental United States, pointed out by these small black dots. Signaled by the black stars are each state's capital, not necessarily their biggest city, but one of them if it was chosen and remains as their capital. I came across this map a few weeks ago and a question came into my mind: why is each of these cities located where they are? Because the vast majority of cities in the US, and to be fair almost everywhere else in the world, are pretty well located. It's a bit of a self-explaining issue. Cities exist in places that are suitable, otherwise they either wouldn't have been created there or they wouldn't have survived. In addition, bigger and major cities are bigger because usually they are more adequately located, although other factors can also come into play. Let's provide a bit of context here. If you want to skip to the cities themselves, you can use the timestamps. The choice of location for the establishment of a human settlement usually has various different criteria depending on the case, and they have evolved and changed throughout history as we'll see ahead, but they tend to follow basic human needs: a fresh water supply, be it a river, lake, or underwater supply accessible through some type of well, and a suitable terrain. Humans have always gotten their food through either foraging, farming, or hunting, and each of these requires a suitable terrain. For instance, if you find yourself in a desert or an intense mountain region, you'll probably think twice before settling your town there. In addition to those basic needs, and sometimes in replacement of them, other factors have appeared and become relevant for the choice of location for human settlements. A military perspective: is it in a military choke point? Is it elevated and thus easier to defend against enemies? Is it surrounded by mountains and so difficult to invade? Available resources: as human economy evolved into more than just survivability and basic sustenance and began involving trade and development, other resources became relevant. Is it close to a source of iron? Is it near a forest? If you've ever played the game Civilization, you will know this more than most. The surrounding tiles of your city are key. Strategic location, mostly being connected to trade, although somewhat to sustenance as well. The biggest example I can think of are coastal cities that developed during the age of European discoveries and colonial empires because they were key points in trade routes. And also political will. A lot of times throughout history, settlements were established not because of any of the previous reasons, but simply because political leaders wanted to rule a specific region for whatever reason, although sometimes those reasons are connected to the previous points or serve as a way to get there. A good example of this is the amount of cities Alexander the Great founded and named Alexandria throughout his conquests in Asia, or, and interesting for this video, the establishment of American settlements in the interior of the continent through the political concept of manifest destiny, where it was sold to Americans that it was their fate to colonize the lands to the west. So after taking that perhaps too long explanation, which of these major settlements are the best placed? In our analyses, we will try to understand three things for each city: when they were established, why their specific location was initially chosen, and how they developed and how their location may have influenced or at least contributed to that development. Let's start with what seems to be an overwhelming agreed upon best located city in the US, Chicago. Today, Chicago is home to almost 3 million people. I believe it's the third most populous city in the US. So how did it get there? In 1833, the town of Chicago was organized with a population of about 200. Within 7 years, it grew to over 6,000. And the early key to its development was precisely its geographic location. Chicago was built as a portage location between the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River system. Connecting these two great water trails meant comparatively easy access from the mouth of the St. Lawrence River, the Atlantic Ocean, to the Rocky Mountains and the Gulf of Mexico. Because of this, it became an easy and important transportation hub between the East and West United States. A flourishing economy brought residents from rural communities and immigrants from abroad, and it kind of snowballed from there, with its economy growing more and more, just as its population. In 1871, the city suffered a great and devastating fire, but it was able to rebuild and remain relevant despite the setback, which I think proves just how valuable its location is, that they prefer to rebuild rather than move somewhere else. When it comes to objective geographic details, it's also incredibly located. It will avoid the rise of sea level due to not being near an ocean. It's supplied by fresh water by the Great Lakes, surrounded by wide expanses of farmland from the Midwest, and also connects to most of inland America, navigable through the Mississippi River and its canals. Now, before we keep going, a quick word from today's sponsor, Incogni. It all revolves around one thing: data. Whether you know it or not, a lot of the websites you use or companies you've bought from keep records of your personal data. With it, these companies can bother you with promotions, they can sell your data to other businesses that will do the same, or worse, your data can fall into the hands of criminals who will leak it or blackmail you for it. Because every year there's hundreds of data breaches into company servers. Just last year, I was notified of my data being breached through the airline I usually use. But here's the good part. Legally, these data brokers that store and potentially sell your data can be forced to delete your personal information if you ask them to. And how do you get them to do it? With Incogni. They reach out to data brokers on your behalf, request your personal data removal, and deal with any objections from their side. I did it a few months ago and I still get updates every month. Until now, they've sent 51 requests for data removal and 36 have been completed. Doing this can have tremendous benefits, especially if you're from the US, like prevent identity fraud or help you get better insurance rates. So try Incogni today at incogni.com/knowledge. You can do it for 30 days for free, and if you choose to continue and sign up, you'll get an incredible 60% discount. Now back to the video. Next, New York City. New York is a global center of commerce today. It has almost 9 million people and is the most populous city in the US. It's located at the southern tip of its state on one of the world's largest natural harbors, the New York Harbor, at the mouth of the Hudson River. Just as with Chicago, it seems this location of a connection between a large deep water protected port and a large navigable river was important. Henry Hudson, after whom I believe the river is named, discovered it in 1609 and was instantly surprised at the wideness of the river and the availability of fish. From very early on, first by the Dutch and then the British, the New York harbor and city became an important site in America. However, New York's growth isn't directly linked with the importance of the harbor, although it's definitely indirectly linked and has in it its cause. The city's exponential growth started in the early 19th century due to the rise of manufacturing in the city, which itself depended on New York's primacy as a port. The construction of the Erie Canal also meant that New York could suddenly be a port of entry and exit to goods imported and exported from the American interior. It connected the Atlantic to the Great Lakes, making New York the gateway to the continental interior in a way that Boston, Philadelphia, or Baltimore could not. Soon after, another canal was built, linking the Great Lakes to the Mississippi River system, as we just saw when we talked about Chicago. In addition, New York also benefited from the fact it was the entryway of most immigrants, mostly from Europe, into the country, again due to having a large port, many of which ended up staying there. Snowballing again, the incredible location led to more people, opportunity, growth of the economy, and that has remained as such up to today. Then also New Orleans. Many say that if not for the Erie Canal, New Orleans would have become the port of choice for American trade due to its strategic location at the mouth of the Mississippi River. The city was still so important that when it was still ruled by the French, the Americans continuously tried to buy it from them, to the point that when they were negotiating for it, they were able to instead buy the whole of Louisiana. And during the 19th century, it became the US's wealthiest and third largest city. Its port shipped produce of much of the nation's interior to the Caribbean and South America, and on the other way in, thousands of enslaved people were taken there to be sold as well. While at the same time, an old Spanish law remained that allowed black people to live freely should they manage to achieve that freedom. That important location at the mouth of the river and this specific situation allowed for a close trade connection with Central and South America, and to some extent Europe as well, which allowed it to grow a lot. New Orleans' geography is also flawed though. Much of it is below sea level and it's built on a swamp, but its location was still always enough to justify its importance. The biggest example, I would argue on par with the Chicago fire, was the fact that Louisiana had the highest death rates of any US state throughout the 1800s due to tropical diseases and yellow fever, but still it remained a key city. More and more, we see how the two coasts, the Great Lakes, and I would argue most of all the Mississippi River, are the source of many of the location choices for American cities. After all, the Mississippi River basin is enormous and covers and connects through water a tremendously large part of the US's territory. Moving to the west coast, San Francisco. California has always been an attractive destination due to its natural resources. San Francisco, at the same time, is located on a key place on the coast of the Pacific Ocean in a fantastically shaped bay that allows for a large natural harbor, as well as a very good defensive location from attacks by sea. This, however, wasn't the key in its development. It was its proximity to another resource, gold. Between 1848 and 1855, San Francisco was transformed from a small town of 800 people into a booming city of over 50,000 due to the discovery of gold in the nearby Sierra Nevada. Just like Chicago or New Orleans, San Francisco was also marked by several serious earthquakes and fires, which still didn't bring the city down. The 1906 earthquake is the biggest example. More than 3,000 people died and over 80% of the city was destroyed, but still it kept going. It was just already too important to be abandoned. In 1915, they held a World Fair and were able to showcase the progress and prosperity that they had achieved, not necessarily from the gold rush directly, but from the influx of population that it brought and the booming economy it caused. This fair and its visitors further boosted its development. The first transcontinental railroad began there and made it possible for people and goods to travel to and from the east coast of America for the first time, and of course spurring the city's growth as a major financial center. Since then, they became known as a place for innovation and entrepreneurship, especially in the tech area. Across the country, Jacksonville in Florida. Not at all in population, but apparently in land size, Jacksonville is the biggest or largest city in the US. It's just that everything is so spread out, some people call it a conglomerate of small towns. This is due to a merger in 1968 of the Jacksonville city and the county of Duval. Its location at the mouth of the St. Johns River was key since native times, and the importance of the colonial settlement was enough for the Spanish to offer it as a ransom to the British in order to recover Havana in Cuba in 1763. But the first population boost came with British development and the creation of plantations along this same river. This led to an increase in population and it becoming the center of commerce in Florida from very early on. During World War II, the US Navy became a major employer and economic force, constructing 3 Navy bases in the area. And it really seems that the snowball effect is real for all of these. A sort of virtuous cycle is created. Specific conditions lead to the creation of a city in this place, then it does well. Because of that, more people come and the economy expands and grows, and the cycle repeats itself at an increasingly bigger scale. Back in the West Coast, Los Angeles. Los Angeles is the second biggest city in the US in terms of people. While its natural conditions are slightly behind those of its West Coast partner, San Francisco, it has in some aspects surpassed it in success. Partly due to resource-related causes, namely the discovery of oil in 1890, which brought rapid growth to the city. Their lack of enough fresh water was resolved with the construction of an aqueduct in 1913. It also has one of the busiest container ports in America, representing roughly 20% of all cargo coming into the United States. What's interesting is that upon the foundation of the city, the port was too small for large ships and it had to be expanded. It was initially fishing, canneries, oil drilling, and shipbuilding that became the major industries that generated jobs and commerce to LA and its growing population, and that led to the need to expand the port. And by 1912, construction widened it enough to be able to accommodate larger vessels. Its film industry has also been a cause for success, being the world's largest, but this one is circumstantial and not caused by location choice. It seems the only location-related causes for success were the proximity to oil resources and the coastal element. Further south, Houston in Texas. The 4th most populated city in the country with over 7 million people, Houston is also near a fantastic natural harbor, Trinity Bay. It also has rivers and lakes that supply it with fresh water. The proximity to the port was key. Landlocked farmers from other parts of Texas brought their produce to Houston and paid to have it shipped from there. By 1860, Houston had emerged as a commercial and railroad hub for the export of cotton. It's a flat area which helps with urban planning and expansion, as well as the early establishment of ranches for animal breeding and farms for food production. Similarly to LA, resources were also key, and its growth was really catapulted by the discovery of oil. In addition, the choice of NASA and its contractors to build and move much of their activity there in 1961, perhaps due to those flat land conditions, led to another boost in the city's growth. Furthermore, in the 1970s, a lot of people from the Rust Belt moved there in search of jobs, since there were a lot of opportunities in the petroleum industry created as a result of the Arab oil embargo. Even with these coincidences that were beneficial, they're always connected to the availability of natural resources in that location. Dallas, Texas, on the other hand, is an opposite example of a city that shouldn't have worked according to those basic criteria and location details. It's apparently one of the largest cities in the world that isn't on a navigable waterway or any natural freshwater supply. It has mostly grown from travel, tourism, and beneficial tax laws that brought with them a lot of big companies that chose to set up their headquarters there in order to pay less taxes. Dallas-Fort Worth is in fact one of the busiest airports in the world, and the lack of water issue was solved through artificial lakes that are supplied by other lakes in the state via pipelines, proving sometimes location isn't everything, it's also what you do with the place. An honorable mention outside the continental USA must go to Anchorage, Alaska. It's at the confluence of the Susitna, Nick, and Matanuska rivers, and the Matanuska Valley contains most of the agriculture in Alaska. It's also kind of immune to land invasions due to its remoteness and the Shogak Mountains. The city grew from its happenstance choice as a site for railroad construction in Alaska to begin in 1914. The waters near Ship Creek were deep enough for barges and small ships to dock and bring in supplies for that construction. So again, water access was the key, especially the coastal location. And as the Northwest Passage becomes a more viable route for trade, its location becomes even more valuable. Even already, from a flight perspective, it seems to be among the top 5 busiest airports in the US, almost entirely due to shipping. When it was first established by the Russians, it wasn't too important, but after the US purchase, gold was found in 1888, which initially led to more people moving there. So, those are some of the best placed cities in the United States, each of them being adequately located for various reasons, sometimes a combination of them, but almost always connected to the natural resources of said location. For a city to be successful, especially since the start of globalization in the 16th century, it doesn't need to fulfill all those initial criteria we first saw. Today, resources move around, trade exists, means of transportation and travel, and so a city can be hugely successful for one single reason that happened to make it so. It's therefore difficult to choose among all these major cities in the US which are the best located, or even to define some as being well located or not. However, I believe the examples we saw in this video illustrate most cases, as the causes for each of their successes are in some extent applicable to each major American city. But what do you think? Do you agree that the cities I showed have a good location? Is that the cause for their success or not? And which other well or poorly located cities exist in the US? Let me know in the comments. Thanks so much for watching this video. Subscribe if you want, and I will see you next time for more general knowledge.